Welcome back, lovely ladies. If you want to become the woman of your dreams, make sure to hit that subscribe button and like this video. And join our Patreon for even more exclusive content. Now, let's dive into today's story.
I was 15 the first time I tried on a skirt in my room. Nobody was home that afternoon, and the silence in the house was almost too loud. My heart thudded so hard I felt like I was announcing my secret to the entire neighborhood. At that time, I couldn't explain why I felt drawn to dresses, skirts, and blouses, but it felt right. I remember tugging on a soft, slightly flowy skirt that belonged to my mom. It was one of her older ones, stuffed into the back of her closet, and I'd seen her wear it maybe once. Trying it on that day made me feel strangely free. Even though it wasn't my size, I remember looking at my reflection in the mirror, thinking that even if it was only for a few moments, I could feel more like the person I wanted to be. Back then, Mom and I lived alone. She and my biological father had separated when I was only 8. I don't recall the details because I was too young to understand them fully. They seemed cordial enough when they needed to be, but I never felt a strong connection to him, and he seldom visited. Mom worked 2 jobs for a while, so I often came home to an empty house. I grew used to the quiet. I also grew used to finding ways to explore this hidden side of me without anyone noticing. For a couple of years, it was just me, Mom, and a small circle of friends who had no clue I had this private hobby. Mom was the first person to guess something was going on, though. She's the type to tidy up the house in random spurts of energy, especially on her days off. One Sunday, when I was still a sophomore in high school, she must have looked into her closet and spotted that skirt I'd moved from its usual place. She didn't say anything right away. Instead, she watched me for a few days, checking if I'd volunteer any explanation. I never did. I was terrified. I assumed that if she put 2 and 2 together, she would react with concern or confusion. Perhaps she would see me differently. One night, though, as we sat in our small living room watching a show, she paused the TV and turned to me. She said, "Hey, you know you can tell me anything, right?" My pulse was pounding, but I nodded. She sighed and confessed she'd noticed some of her clothes had been rearranged. She wanted to know if I needed my own. The way she phrased it made my face burn. I remember stammering something about curiosity, about wanting to know what it felt like to wear something different. And I expected her to go on a lecture or show signs of disapproval. Instead, she just nodded, looking slightly uncertain but calm. She pulled me into a hug and whispered, "I don't have a problem with it, okay? Please remember that." I don't think she fully grasped how important that moment was for me. It became this little foundation of trust, one that I was grateful for, though I was still too young and timid to fully explore what it meant. Over the next year, she would let me take some of her older, looser outfits if I wanted. We kept it discreet. She didn't bring it up around other people, and I never asked for anything new, at least not while I was still in high school. It was a secret she and I kind of shared, even if we rarely discussed it. She wasn't sure how to guide me, and I wasn't sure how to tell her everything on my mind. That changed the year I turned 16, because that was when Gary entered our lives. Mom had gone on a few dates here and there. Most didn't pan out into anything serious. Suddenly, she met Gary through a mutual friend, and I saw a side of her I hadn't seen in a long time. She would come home smiling, laughing into her phone, making references to inside jokes I wasn't part of. Then one weekend, she introduced me to him, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a firm handshake and an easy grin. Gary had that casual approach to life. He liked barbecues, baseball, working on cars in the driveway with a rag in his hand, and an old radio playing rock tunes by his side. He was, for lack of a better term, what people might call old-fashioned masculine. That meant I had no clue how he'd react if he learned about my interest in wearing clothing usually reserved for women. At first, I kept a polite distance. He tried to bridge that distance by inviting me to watch basketball with him or help him wash his truck, but I didn't jump at these offers. He didn't push me, and I secretly appreciated that. Mom started dating him more seriously, and soon enough, he was around nearly every weekend. I remember glaring at his big duffel bag by the door one Saturday morning and thinking, he's not just a guest anymore. But I never said anything to Mom. It was obvious how happy she was, and I couldn't bring myself to spoil that. Though I have to admit, I feared what would happen if that man, who gave off such a strong macho vibe, ever discovered that I liked to keep skirts in my closet. So I grew increasingly careful about how and when I explored that part of my wardrobe. Gary moved in with us a month or so before my 17th birthday. The wedding happened less than a year later. Maybe it felt a bit fast, but I couldn't ignore that he treated Mom well. She, in turn, looked less stressed. She cut back on one of her jobs, since Gary had a decent income and they made finances work together. For me, it was an adjustment. The nights of privacy dwindled. I had to find new ways to keep my secret hidden, like wearing a skirt only late at night or in the locked bathroom. My old comfort of strolling around the house in something soft and flowing was gone. But I told myself it was the price of Mom's happiness, and I was willing to pay it. If Gary was going to be part of our family, I just needed to keep this side of me hidden. Yet during that time, something new stirred in me. The older I got, the more I recognized that what I was doing wasn't just an experiment. It was more ingrained in me. I remember buying my first skirt, one that actually fit me, at a thrift store downtown when I was almost 18. I stuffed it in a backpack and wore it for 5 minutes in my room that night, listening for the faintest creak in the hallway. My heart hammered against my ribcage, terrified that Gary might burst in. He never did. When I graduated high school, I was unsure what path I wanted to follow. I toyed with the idea of going to a local community college, but my grades were middling at best. I wasn't exactly a bad student, but my lack of focus in class meant I wasn't in line for any substantial scholarships. Meanwhile, Gary would occasionally talk to me about trade schools or jobs that might pay well. He'd say, "There's nothing wrong with working with your hands, you know. Plenty of honest careers out there that don't require burying your nose in textbooks." Mom was ambivalent about that advice, insisting that I should choose whatever felt right. I found myself nodding along, quietly anxious because I still wasn't ready to show either of them the full picture of who I was. A few months after I turned 18, I was about to enter a program for automotive repair at the local community college. Gary was thrilled, seeing as he was a big car guy. He'd spend afternoons showing me how to do an oil change or replace worn-out brake pads. It was straightforward work, but he turned it into something that felt like father-son bonding. I have to admit, it wasn't bad. For once, we had something in common. He'd talk about engine troubles, I'd nod, and we'd share a few laughs over how each of us nearly dropped a tool in the oil pan. Beneath that calm, though, I would think about my hidden skirts and wonder if Gary would see me differently if he knew. Occasionally, I'd overhear him and my mother talking late at night. I recall hearing phrases like, "He's a good kid, just quiet," or "I don't want him to feel lonely." That was Gary's voice. He genuinely seemed to be trying to connect with me. Yet I still pictured him discovering me in a dress and reacting with shock or anger. It was an image that haunted me, so I continued to push it down. Whenever he suggested we hang out at a ball game or go fishing, I would sometimes accept, sometimes decline, but I never felt comfortable enough to truly open up. Mom must have picked up on that over the years. She would watch me from across the room with this knowing, slightly sad look, as though she realized I was hiding something from the man who now counted me as his son. Gary had a large extended family, which meant we often visited them for barbecues or holiday gatherings. His side of the family was a colorful mix: uncles who loved to crack jokes, aunts who had no problem shouting from the kitchen, young cousins who ran around barefoot in the yard. I met Troy, one of Gary's nephews, a couple of times. Troy was around my age, but seemed more free-spirited and bold, with a sharp sense of humor and an unshakable confidence. One weekend, I noticed something interesting. Troy was wearing a bright rainbow pin on his jacket. He was openly gay. Gary treated him with the same warmth he gave every other relative, passing him the plate of ribs and asking him about classes. I observed Gary pat Troy on the shoulder, telling him he was always welcome. That stuck with me. It hinted that maybe the rigid masculinity I associated with Gary wasn't as rigid as I feared. Yet still, the thought that cross-dressing could be more difficult for him to understand gnawed at me. Being gay was one thing, I thought. Wearing skirts might be a bridge too far for him, so I remained silent. In the meantime, my life continued to unfold in small, everyday ways. Going to classes, working a part-time job at a local diner, returning home late at night. At the diner, I met a few co-workers who became casual friends, but I never opened up to them about what I kept in my closet. Then there were nights I'd come home and quietly slip into my room, wanting just a moment to feel that soft fabric around my legs. It became a pattern, a bit lonely, but familiar. When I turned 20, I moved out for a year to live in a shared apartment with 2 roommates. Neither were close friends, but I found the place near campus, so it was convenient. Both guys seemed decent enough. They were the type to drink beer, watch sports, and occasionally throw a party on weekends. We got along fine, but I never told them anything private. I just found it easier to hide. But once in a while, I'd have a moment alone, and I'd wear something that felt more like me. Some piece of clothing that contrasted with my usual plain t-shirt and jeans. Every time I did so, I'd get this rush, a sense that I was allowing a more real part of myself to see the light, if only briefly. The roommates eventually drifted apart after that year. One moved for a new job, the other decided to live with his girlfriend. So I found myself moving back into Mom and Gary's house at 21 to save money. By then, Gary and I were on decent terms. We could talk about everyday events, watch a movie together, or joke around at dinner. He rarely pried into my personal life, figuring I'd speak up if I needed something. From time to time, he'd knock gently on my door and ask, "Everything good?" I'd nod, and he'd walk away with a small wave. Then, a few months after my 22nd birthday, something changed in our extended family. Troy, that confident cousin of Gary's, came out to the family a second time. This time, he was clarifying more aspects about himself, making it clear he was bringing his boyfriend to the next gathering. Gary was the first to stand up and clap him on the shoulder with a proud grin. Some older relatives had more cautious or unsure reactions, but Gary said in his gruff voice, "Hey, family's family." I caught a glimpse of that moment, how Gary gave Troy a quick hug and turned on a ball game as if to say, "No big deal." I remember sitting in the living room that evening, swirling a soda in a glass, thinking, maybe Gary is more open-minded than I assumed. It planted a seed of courage in me. Over the following weeks, that seed grew, as did my anxiety. I couldn't stop imagining the myriad ways Gary could respond if I told him what I'd been hiding for so many years. My biggest fear was that the quiet comfort we'd built would shatter, that he'd look at me with disgust or shock. But another part of me, tired of leading this hidden life, wanted to know if I could trust him with it. I kept replaying the memory of him hugging Troy. It gave me a strange sort of hope. So I started planning. I decided I'd wait for a moment when Mom wasn't around, maybe a quiet evening, so we could talk man to man. In the days leading up to it, I was a nervous wreck. I couldn't focus on my part-time work at the diner. I kept mixing up orders. My manager teased me, saying I was daydreaming. My friends noticed I was more withdrawn. Even my mom asked if I was feeling well. I just said I was tired. My plan was to show Gary a photo. Maybe it wouldn't feel as intense as showing him in person. I felt that a photo would create just enough emotional distance so he could see it without me physically standing there in a skirt. It might sound strange, but it helped calm my nerves. I remember that day vividly. It was a cloudy Tuesday afternoon, the sky threatening a drizzle. Mom had stepped out to run errands, leaving Gary and me alone in the house. He was in the living room, flipping channels on the TV, half-heartedly searching for something to watch until the evening baseball game started. I stood in the hallway, phone clenched in my hand, trying to gather courage. My heart pounded with such force I was sure he would hear me coming. Eventually I walked in, cleared my throat, and sat down on the couch next to him. He seemed a bit surprised. Usually I'd say a quick hello, maybe watch the game from the armchair, but not settle in beside him. I remember him asking, "Something on your mind, kid?" He still called me kid, even though I was 22. I exhaled slowly and managed to say, "There's, something I want to tell you and show you." His expression turned serious, but not in a judgmental way, more like concern. He muted the TV, turned slightly to face me, and said, "Shoot." I opened the photo gallery on my phone, scrolled through a few images until I found the one. Me wearing a blue skirt that wasn't too flashy, paired with a plain t-shirt. It was taken in my room, and my face wore a bit of a nervous smile. My hair was combed nicely that day. I'd fussed over every detail in that shot before saving it, thinking it looked tasteful enough. I held the phone out to him. Gary gave me a quizzical look, then took the phone. He studied the photo for a few seconds. I watched the flicker of surprise cross his features, maybe even a moment of confusion. Then he looked at me, eyebrows raised. I felt my palms go sweaty. I was ready for a barrage of questions or some knee-jerk exclamation of disbelief, but that didn't happen. Instead, he looked at the picture again, then back at me and asked quietly, "Is that you?" I nodded, barely breathing. He let out a short, thoughtful breath. "Okay. Well, if that's something that makes you feel good, then that's your call." I could hardly process his words. A small stammer escaped me. You're not mad?" He shrugged, still looking curious, but not upset. "Why would I be mad? You're not hurting anyone. Might not be my thing, but that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it." I was so relieved I nearly laughed out loud. My chest felt lighter. I remember telling him, "I've been doing this for years. Didn't know how you'd react." Gary set the phone on his thigh, turned the TV's volume up just a notch and said, "I won't pretend I fully get it, but if it makes you happy, kid, that's all that matters to me." He offered a reassuring pat on my shoulder, then turned his attention back to finding the ball game. It was as if he saw no reason to dwell on it or make a big deal out of it. So that's how I ended up sitting there in stunned silence while he flipped channels, the weight of years of worry dissolving in that small moment. That conversation, though brief, changed something in me. It felt surreal that after all my anxiety, Gary's reaction was basically acceptance. Over the next few days, I noticed him glancing at me thoughtfully every now and again, as though checking if I was okay. But he never made jokes at my expense, never gave me pitying looks, never tried to talk me out of it. He would invite me to watch baseball or help change a tire just like before. One evening, he did say, "You can wear whatever you want in this house, you know. No need to hide." Hearing that from him gave me a strange mix of relief and embarrassment. I wasn't ready to stroll around in a skirt in front of him, but I appreciated the offer. Mom eventually learned that Gary knew. I didn't hide that from her. One afternoon, she cornered me in the kitchen, turning off the faucet and leaning in. She asked, "So, Gary told me you showed him a photo. You okay with it?" I nodded, trying to calm my racing pulse. I guess part of me was still worried, despite Gary's support, that maybe Mom would have second thoughts. But she just gave a small smile and said, "He's your dad now, in every way that matters, and he wants you to feel comfortable." We had a brief hug. It was oddly emotional, because it felt like a final confirmation that our family ties were strong enough to handle this. Time rolled on. I returned to my daily routines, but I felt more relaxed, freer to be myself. There were small steps. Maybe I'd wear a soft sweater with a more feminine cut around the house. Or once, when Mom and Gary were out, I'd slip on a skirt to watch TV, not frantically checking the window every 5 seconds. If Gary came home early, I'd dart to my room, feeling a surge of nerves, but also a sense of amusement that I didn't have to run as if my life depended on it. It was no longer a secret that defined my relationship with him. We never did have a huge heart-to-heart about it. Gary wasn't the kind of guy to have lengthy, emotional discussions, but every so often, he'd acknowledge it in small ways. For instance, I recall one Sunday morning, we had coffee together on the porch. He stared off into the yard, where the grass glistened with dew. Without looking at me, he said, "You know, kid, if you ever want to just come down in whatever clothes you like, I'm not going to blink an eye." I paused mid-sip. "Thanks," I said. That was that. He sipped his coffee, the sunlight warming both of us, and we chatted about random things, a movie we wanted to see, how the neighbor's dog wouldn't stop barking at night. It felt normal. It felt nice. A few weeks later, we had a family barbecue at Gary's brother's house. Troy was there with his boyfriend. It was the first time he was bringing him around the entire family. While Gary grilled hot dogs, I watched Troy hold hands with his boyfriend, introducing him to various aunts and uncles. A couple of them gave polite but lukewarm greetings, yet nobody caused a scene. Gary, of course, waved them over to the grill, asked them how they liked their burgers, and told them to make themselves at home. It was hard not to admire how easy he was about it. It reminded me that my own concerns, while valid, might have been tinted by fear that wasn't entirely necessary. Troy wandered over to me while Gary was busy flipping burgers. He gave me a sideways grin. "You seem more relaxed," he said, noticing something in my posture or demeanor. I shrugged. "Just feels nice around here lately." I thought about telling Troy everything, but decided I wasn't quite ready. I did ask him how it was coming out to the family. He shrugged and said, "Gary was one of the easiest. A lot of folks talk a big game, but your stepdad? He's as genuine as it gets." He took a swig from a soda can, then looked at me pointedly. "If you ever need to talk about anything, I'm around, okay?" I managed a small nod, appreciative. Though it felt strange hearing it from someone I used to consider almost a stranger, it comforted me that he saw me in a different light too. After that afternoon, I began to open up a bit more around the house. I still hadn't strolled into the living room in a skirt in front of Gary, but I didn't hide it as intensely as before. Sometimes I'd fold my laundry openly in the living room, my skirts included. If Gary walked by, he'd just give a cursory glance, maybe nod, and continue on his way. One day, he tapped the fabric of one skirt curiously and asked, "What's it made of?" I told him it was cotton, and he shrugged and said, "Looks comfortable." That was it. No heavy conversation. Life carried on in that steady way until a small family emergency happened. Gary's mother fell ill and had to stay at the hospital for a few nights. Everyone was on edge, especially Gary. Although he kept his composure, I could sense the tension in his eyes. Mom was often at the hospital, and I'd join sometimes. We'd bring food, keep his mother company, fill out forms. In those tense days, the closeness of our family became more evident. I watched Gary talk gently to his mom, smoothing down the blanket on her bed, making sure she had water. He wasn't just a caricature of a macho man. He was a man who cared deeply for those around him. Seeing that softened me even more toward him. The fear I once had about him finding me weird felt like a distant memory. Maybe the real test of family was how we supported each other when life took a difficult turn. Thankfully, she recovered. That relief washed over all of us like a warm wave. We went out to celebrate with a simple dinner at home, Gary's mother sitting at our table, wearing a big smile. That was the night I decided to test out Gary's earlier promise. After I finished my shift at the diner, I came home, took a quick shower, and slipped into a comfy skirt and a t-shirt. I took a deep breath at my bedroom door, then walked out into the hallway. It was early evening. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air, and I could hear chatter from the dining room. My mother's voice, Gary's mother's soft laugh, and Gary's deeper baritone. Each step I took down that hallway seemed longer than normal. But when I arrived in the dining room, everyone turned. Gary's mother gave me a quick once-over, raising her eyebrows slightly, then smiled. "Well, you look comfortable," she said kindly. Mom shot me a supportive nod, and Gary said nothing but gave me a small grin, as if to say, "Told you it was fine." We had dinner, chatted about her hospital stay, joked about how Gary had apparently tried to cook one of her old recipes and nearly burned it. Gary's mom asked me about my classes, teased me about my part-time gig. The fact that I was wearing a skirt just seemed to fade into the background. No one made a big deal out of it. At one point, I caught Gary's eye, and he winked at me. It felt good, truly good. That week, Troy texted me, saying he heard from Gary's mom that I was dressed in something more to my style at dinner. He wrote, "Kudos to you. My boyfriend and I are rooting for you." I chuckled at my phone. Word spread fast in that family, apparently, but all the messages I received were neutral or downright supportive. Some relatives might have been a bit unsure how to phrase their reactions, but nobody lashed out. The realization that nobody was going to ostracize me was almost overwhelming. I had spent years assuming the worst, only to find that this family was more open-minded and kind than I gave them credit for. I started wearing skirts more often around the house. Gary rarely commented, but in a good way. It was like me wearing a hoodie or a pair of jeans, just another outfit, part of everyday life. We still watched baseball together. He'd sit in his recliner, I'd lounge on the couch in my skirt, and we'd discuss which team had a stronger bullpen. Sometimes Mom joined us, or she'd read a book in the kitchen with a cup of tea. After a while, the novelty wore off completely, and I found myself just living, no longer preoccupied with what they thought of me. That shift was subtle but profound. Still, not everything was smooth sailing. That same month, an old high school friend of mine came over. He was more of the tough guy type, though we got along for the most part. I decided to remain in my skirt when answering the door. His reaction was not hateful, but definitely puzzled. He raised both hands in surprise and asked, "Dude, what's going on?" I told him plainly that this was something I liked and that Gary and Mom were fine with it. He sort of shook his head, trying to wrap his mind around it. The visit was a bit awkward. We played video games and tried to keep it casual, but I sensed he was still thinking about it. By the time he left, he muttered something like, "Hey, do whatever, I guess," which wasn't the worst reaction, but I knew some people outside my family might not take it in stride. Even so, I didn't hide it. And Gary, overhearing our conversation, later told me, "Not everyone's going to get it, but as long as you're comfortable, that's what counts." And that was that. A few weeks later, I had an interesting conversation with Gary in the garage. He was changing the spark plugs on our sedan, sweat beading on his forehead. I offered him a cold drink and asked if he ever had times in his life when he was worried about how others would view him. He gave me a quizzical look. "Sure, who doesn't? When I was younger, I thought about going into a different line of work, still mechanical, but dealing with something more specialized. Everyone around me acted like I had to stick to the family tradition of working at the local factory. I ended up following that path for a while, but eventually, I decided it wasn't for me. Some folks gave me a hard time, but I didn't let that stop me. Then he wiped his brow and said, "Sometimes the world tries to tell you what you should do or how you should look, but that doesn't mean it's always right." His response meant a lot more to me than he probably realized. It wasn't directly about my outfits, but it indirectly recognized my situation. That small conversation was a reminder that even the most seemingly traditional person might have had their own run-ins with society's expectations. It made me see him in a new light, and it strengthened our bond. I became bolder in small ways. I started going out to do errands in a skirt, short ones at first, maybe an errand like picking up groceries. My hometown wasn't very large, and I sometimes got curious looks from strangers, or even from people I recognized from high school. But it didn't escalate beyond curiosity. If a disapproving glance came my way, I brushed it off. The surprising part was how often people didn't react at all. So many people were busy with their own tasks, they hardly noticed. When Gary found out I was wearing skirts in public, he asked if I was safe. I told him I was managing, and he nodded, telling me, "If anyone tries to start trouble, you call me, all right?" I grinned, imagining Gary rolling up in his truck to defend me. It was oddly comforting. By the time I'd been 22 for half a year, cross-dressing around my family was practically an everyday thing. Mom would leave a neat pile of fresh laundry in my room. Sometimes it would be my t-shirts, sometimes it would be a new skirt she found on sale. She'd tease me about it, saying, "I wasn't sure if it was your style, but the price was too good to pass up." Gary might notice a new blouse and raise an eyebrow in a half-joking way. "You been shopping again?" But never with any malice, just that light ribbing that families do. One turning point was the day Gary admitted he had told a few extended relatives about it, casually, in passing conversation. He wasn't divulging my secrets maliciously, more like matter-of-fact updates. I only realized it when his brother's wife came over with a batch of cookies, knocked on my door and said, "I heard you're exploring some new wardrobe choices. That's cool." I was surprised but managed to smile and thank her for the cookies. Later, Gary apologized if he'd overstepped. He said, "I just didn't think it was something to hide. I wasn't trying to make it a big announcement or anything." I told him it was fine. I wasn't upset. It was still surreal to see how comfortable he was, considering how I'd once pictured him as the last person who would understand. Another interesting development was with my cousin on my mom's side, someone close to my age who had come out as gay a while back. She visited us for the weekend, and the two of us ended up chatting in my room about the entire situation. I explained that I was terrified of telling Gary for years, and she chuckled, saying, "I was more worried about telling your mom than my own parents, to be honest, but your mom's actually super chill." Then she pointed at one of my skirts hanging on a chair and said, "That's a cute one. Where'd you get it?" I admitted it was from a thrift store. She teased me for not letting her in on my thrift runs. It was the kind of talk I never thought I'd have with a cousin in my room, casual and friendly. I realized how far I'd come from the teenager who hid in a locked bathroom, flinching at every sound in the hallway. At times, Gary would still do something that reminded me of his macho side, like get overly enthusiastic about a particular baseball team or go on about a car engine upgrade he wanted. But now, it wasn't intimidating. It was just Gary being Gary, and I was me being me. There was mutual respect. We found common ground in plenty of areas, and in others, we were different, but it didn't matter. We'd learned how to exist in the same space without friction. That felt like a gift in a world that was often more complicated. As the months rolled on, I even started to think about how I might expand my horizons. Maybe I'd pick up more hours at the diner, or look for something new. Gary encouraged me to consider finishing my degree, or taking specialized courses in automotive repair. I hadn't ruled it out. I felt more free in general, so anything seemed possible. It wasn't just about clothing anymore. It was about the confidence to make choices that aligned with my true self. Although I never used the exact phrase for it, I understood on some level that I was living more openly, no longer weighing every choice against the fear of rejection at home. Gary's next birthday rolled around, and Mom wanted to throw a simple party in the backyard. She asked me to help with decorations. We decided on a sports-themed approach, obviously, given Gary's interests. We found baseball-themed balloons, napkins, and even a big banner. The day of the party, I threw on a comfy skirt with a t-shirt that featured a small embroidered baseball on the sleeve, just to tie into the theme lightly. When Gary walked outside and saw me hanging the banner, he chuckled. "You know, I almost expected you to wear a baseball jersey like the rest of us," he teased. I laughed and gestured to the little baseball on my sleeve. "Hey, I'm still showing team spirit," I joked. That day, the house was full of people, relatives, neighbors, some of Gary's old co-workers. I helped greet guests, wearing what felt good to me, and no one gave me any strange looks. It was incredible, honestly. I felt as though I'd stepped into an alternate universe where everyone was simply getting along, enjoying food and company, without caring that I was dressed outside conventional norms. A few guests made small talk with me about my outfit, but more in a complimentary or neutral tone, not in a harsh or mocking way. Midway through the party, Gary came over to pat my shoulder and say, "Great job with everything today. The place looks great." Then he called out to Mom, telling her I did all the heavy lifting. She rolled her eyes and said, "He did, but don't let it go to his head." We all laughed. Later that evening, after the last guest left and we were cleaning up, Gary ended up beside me at the garbage bin, tossing paper plates. The sun was nearly down, leaving a deep orange glow in the sky. I mentioned how proud I was that everything went smoothly, and Gary paused, throwing one last stack of plates into the bin. He turned to me and said, "I'm proud of you too, kid." His voice had that sincere undertone that only showed up in rare moments. I felt a wave of emotion that I tried to keep in check. "Thanks," I managed to say. He reached over, squeezed my arm lightly, and added, "I never told you this, but you've got guts, trusting me with something so important. I know it wasn't easy for you." It stunned me for a moment. I hadn't realized he'd been thinking about it in that way. I swallowed and answered, "I was more scared than you can imagine for years." Gary exhaled, tapping the side of the bin. "Yeah, I could guess. I'm sorry if I ever made you feel like you couldn't be open about who you are." I shook my head quickly. "No, it's not your fault. I built it up in my mind, you know." He gave a half smile, a little sad. "Life's complicated, but I'm glad you're comfortable now. I want you to be." That was one of the few times we touched on the subject so directly, acknowledging the emotional undercurrents. In a household not particularly full of heart-to-heart talks, it felt significant. It reminded me that while Gary might have grown up with certain norms, he also had a big heart and enough flexibility to see his family as they truly were, unconventional wardrobe choices and all. It took us years, but we'd reached a place of genuine understanding. Over the next few weeks, daily life resumed. I juggled work and personal time, occasionally flipping through catalogs or browsing thrift shops for more pieces to add to my collection. Mom and Gary did the same old routines: work, coffee on the porch, weekend chores. Sometimes I'd help Gary tinker with the car. Other times I'd stay in my room, reading or playing a video game. Everything was normal, only with less tension and fewer secrets. One Sunday, after a shared lunch, Gary suggested we go to a baseball game together, just the two of us. My immediate thought was, should I dress in a way that fits in with the crowd more? I'd been wearing skirts so often, but I also didn't want to attract trouble. Sensing my hesitation, Gary said, "Don't worry about the crowd. We'll find seats, have some hot dogs, enjoy the game, wear what you like." That was enough encouragement for me. I chose a more casual knee-length skirt, paired with a t-shirt in the team's color. When we arrived at the stadium, I did get a few looks from other fans, but no one said anything hostile. Gary and I cheered, ate peanuts, shook our fists when the umpire called a questionable strike. It was a genuinely fun outing, a father and son type of day in all but the most traditional sense. We talked about how the team might do this season, whether or not they'd make the playoffs. Not once did Gary act uncomfortable. If anything, he seemed proud to show that we were out having a good time, side by side. During the drive home, we chatted about the players and complained about the traffic. At a red light, Gary glanced over at me. "You know, I'm still learning. This is all new to me, but I want you to know that I'm proud to have you as part of my family." He didn't elaborate further. He didn't need to. I felt my chest tighten in a warm way, and I just said, "Thanks, Gary." He nodded, turned his attention back to the road, and that was that. As we drove on, I realized that moment could have been a sappy, drawn-out conversation, but we both seemed to prefer the short, meaningful approach. In the months that followed, my life continued with more confidence. I found myself opening up to a few more friends. Some were supportive. A couple stepped back, unsure how to react. But overall, I built a small circle of people who understood me. And I always had the unwavering support from Mom and Gary at home. The dynamic between us only grew stronger. I ended up enrolling in a more advanced course related to automotive work, with Gary's enthusiastic backing. He introduced me to some of his buddies in the field, and a few times I showed up to networking events wearing clothes that made me feel at ease. Some folks stared, some didn't care. But I was no longer burdened by the weight of wondering how my closest family would react. Gary's acceptance, brief though it was in that pivotal living room moment, had shaped my outlook on the future. As time went on, I noticed subtle changes in Gary too. He was more open-minded about many things. He'd remark, "Kids these days are trying different stuff. Good for them," when he saw new trends or subcultures on TV. It was never said with mockery, more like genuine curiosity. Mom would grin whenever she heard him say something like that, probably remembering how she once worried about bringing the two of us together. Now, it felt like everything had fallen into place more smoothly than we could have ever planned. Not too long after my 23rd birthday, we went to a family reunion on my mother's side. We hadn't seen some of those relatives in years. It was held in a rented lodge by a lake. I wore a light summer skirt because it was scorching hot that day. We arrived and I sensed a few of my aunts and uncles double take when they saw me, but nobody made any unkind comments. Gary went around introducing himself as my stepdad. He'd say, "Yeah, we've been family for a while now," and would casually mention that I was doing well in my automotive course. At some point, one of my uncles pulled Gary aside, probably to ask about me. I couldn't hear all the details, but I saw Gary shake his head, laugh lightly, and say something that ended with, "No problem at all." The two of them parted on friendly terms. It reassured me that Gary was in my corner, even when I wasn't there to defend myself. By the time we left that reunion, I realized how little I'd thought about my wardrobe or how others viewed it. I was just me, enjoying the day, talking to relatives, eating too many slices of watermelon. Gary's presence had become a source of comfort instead of stress. That evening before bed, I caught him in the hallway, thanked him for talking to my uncle on my behalf, He gave me a baffled look, as if it was obvious. "Why wouldn't I? You're my family." I went to bed with a smile that night. It was a far cry from who I'd been as a 16-year-old, trembling at the thought of Gary finding a skirt in my bedroom. Life was different now. Better. Not perfect, but definitely more whole. And as I drifted to sleep, I couldn't help but think back on all those years of secrecy, the nights of quietly wishing I could be more authentic. It struck me that sometimes all it takes is one step, one conversation, to dismantle all the fears we've built up. Gary had shown me that a single calm statement, "If it makes you happy, kid, that's all that matters," could unravel a huge weight from my shoulders. Even now, looking back, I won't pretend it was easy, but seeing Gary's acceptance in his own understated way was enough to shift my world. My mom had been there for me from the start, and the fact that Gary, with all his sports and cars and classic dad vibes, could be that steady source of support too, it still feels a bit unbelievable. Yet it's real. We still have our everyday routines, small squabbles over who left the dishes in the sink or which brand of coffee to buy. But underneath it all, there's a stable bond. On a quiet night, sometimes I'll find Gary in the living room, flipping through channels, a bored expression on his face. I'll plop down next to him, wearing whatever outfit I feel like wearing, and ask what's on TV. He might grunt something about there being no good baseball matches on. Then he'll glance my way, grin, and say, "But you might like that fashion show on Channel 7. I'll roll my eyes, he'll chuckle, and we'll settle on some random movie. That's family life for us, and it's more than enough. I see glimpses of how this has changed Gary too. Maybe he used to be more set in his ways, but now he sees the world with a slightly different perspective. Whenever a friend or co-worker of his mentions someone exploring different styles or identities, he's quick to say, "You gotta let people be who they are." He doesn't realize how impactful that statement can be, but every time I hear it, I feel a warmth in my chest. It's a reminder of how much things have evolved. We're not perfect. We're not saints. Sometimes I know there are relatives who might talk behind our backs. Occasionally, I notice the sideways glances from neighbors. That's okay, because behind the front door of our home, we know we have each other. Gary, my mom, and me, our own little unit, proof that life can take unexpected turns and still end up just fine. There was a time I thought I'd have to hide forever. I thought cross-dressing would ruin my relationship with Gary, that he'd never see me as the son he wanted. But now, I realize how little credit I gave him. We might not see the world in exactly the same way, but he respects me, and I respect him. We carry that mutual regard day after day, whether we're talking about cars or baseball or the next family barbecue. Our house is a place where I can be myself without shame, and that's something I'll never take for granted. Last week, I met Troy for coffee downtown. He brought his boyfriend, and we ended up comparing our experiences. Troy already knew Gary was supportive, but hearing the full story made him smile. "I always figured Gary had a soft spot," he said, sipping his latte. His boyfriend agreed, adding, "The quiet ones can surprise you." I couldn't help but laugh, thinking about how I used to dread Gary's footsteps in the hallway, worried he'd knock on my door and find me in a skirt. Now, I'd greet him without a second thought. It's amazing how far we've come. When I look toward the future, my career, the possibility of moving out again, maybe even traveling, I feel a sense of calm. Gary's reaction gave me the confidence to believe that I won't be alone in facing what comes next. Mom has always been my rock, but now I have Gary there too, supporting me in ways I once thought impossible. Sometimes a simple photo and a simple statement can shift the entire landscape of a person's life. That's exactly what happened that day I showed Gary the photo on my phone. I expected an earthquake. Instead, I found a steady shoulder. I'm 22 now, And if you asked me at 16 whether I believed my stepdad would be okay with me wearing skirts, I would have laughed at the absurdity. Yet here we are. He still calls me kid, still flips the channel to baseball, still invites me to help him with the car. The difference is, I'm not shrinking into my room to hide who I am. I'm out there with him, wearing whatever reflects how I feel, chatting about any topic under the sun. And that sense of belonging is something words can barely capture. We don't talk about labels much in our house. We just talk about what works for us, how we can support one another, and what's for dinner. It's surprisingly normal, this newfound closeness. I guess I used to think major revelations had to come with endless drama or tension, but sometimes they can be quiet and almost anticlimactic. Gary accepted me so matter-of-factly that I was left speechless. And now, all the worry leading up to it feels like a distant memory. One evening, I found an old photo of me and Gary from right after he married Mom. I was 16 in the photo, wearing an uncomfortable button-down shirt for the wedding, standing stiffly next to this broad-shouldered man with a proud grin. I looked so uneasy. It was a bittersweet reminder of how terrified I was back then, of him, of his opinions, of the possibility that he'd reject this big part of me. I keep that picture pinned to a corkboard in my room. Next to it, I pinned a much more recent photo, me in a skirt, leaning on the family car while Gary stands next to me holding a wrench, both of us grinning for the camera. He looks the same, but I look different, not just in the clothing, but in the ease of my posture. I treasure that contrast. It shows how time and understanding can transform something I once believed was doomed. These days, Gary and Mom joke that they have to set aside some closet space for me, since my wardrobe has expanded. My friends occasionally see glimpses of Gary in the background if they FaceTime me, and he'll pop over to say hello, sometimes teasing me for hogging the bandwidth. It's mundane, ordinary family life, and that's the point. The conversation we had on that cloudy Tuesday afternoon took only a couple of minutes, but it echoed for years, shaping who we became to each other. So here I stand, a young man with an unusual wardrobe, living under the same roof as a stepdad I once thought would never understand. And in the end, he proved me wrong in the best possible way. If I close my eyes, I can still see the living room that afternoon, Gary flipping through TV channels, muting the sound, turning to me and calmly saying, "If it makes you happy, kid, that's all that matters to me." Then the game came on, and life went on, and somehow everything was different for the better. I wouldn't trade that moment for anything. It's the kind of thing that reminds me how surprising people can be. Maybe the world is full of unexpected allies, more than I once dared to believe. Gary will never be the kind of person who sits me down for a big, heart-rending conversation, but he's shown, in countless small gestures, that he's here for me, no matter what, and that's more than enough. Sometimes I'll think back to how it all started, a shaky teenager slipping into a borrowed skirt, heart pounding in the silence of an empty house. At the time, I felt alone in that moment. Now I realize I was never truly alone. Maybe physically, yes, but there was always the possibility of acceptance waiting down the line. It just took me years, a bit of bravery, and a simple conversation to see it. And for that, I'll forever be grateful to Gary. Because at the end of the day, he's shown me what genuine family can look like. Right here, in our own backyard, sitting on a porch with a baseball game on, not a care in the world about what anyone else thinks.
Did you like the story? Hit that like button and tell me what you thought in the comments. Do you want to hear more stories? Subscribe and hit the bell. For exclusive content and early access, check out our Patreon. You can find the link in the description, or you can watch any of the videos shown on my right. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.